Benjamin Britten's Phantasy Quartet Opus 2. I've had the pleasure of playing a number of Britten's works, and his chamber music in particular excites me. He wrote only 4 chamber and solo pieces for the oboe, including 2 insect pieces, 6 metamorphoses after Ovid, temporal variations, and finally, the Phantasy Quartet Opus 2, which we will discuss in detail today. I personally enjoy this piece because it shows a great amount of personality. It's well written for the oboe. It is full of careful construction and the clever patterns beneath the surface that never interfere with the easy listening that I'm sure you all will appreciate today. We will start with a discussion of the composer himself and track how he began his journey with music and what influences led up to the composition of the Phantasy Quartet. Born November 22nd, 1913 in Lowestoft, United Kingdom, Benjamin was the youngest of 4 children. His mother was an amateur singer and his father a surgeon, so his family was well off enough to support his musical aspirations. He heard most of the music during his youth in his own home and was naturally inclined to experiment with music. He began composing at the age of 5 and writes later that he was inspired by real-life events, including school, sports, and even young love at this earliest stage. He then started piano lessons 1 year later with the town's resident piano tutor and took on the viola at age 10. His interests and talents developed quickly, and his teacher saw potential early on. After a performance of his work, Frank Bridge was introduced to what would become his most famous pupil by the viola teacher who at the time saw immense potential and wished to launch Britten into a successful career as a composer. At the age of 12, Britten blew Frank Bridge away with the quality and extent of his work, and Bridge formally took Britten on as a student 2 years later. There is some debate in research texts about where Britten found his earliest influences. The Cambridge Companion states that Britten owned the largest number of Britten miniature scores, more than any other time by a composer. Britten himself has said that his earliest work included hectic gestures, and some theorists believe that his collection of Beethoven scores was his influence. Within a few years of starting lessons with Bridge, he turned his attention to Mozart for inspiration, and he aimed for the unruffled control and good technique that he found there. Another source, though unproven by Britten's diaries or comments, argues that as he grew, Britten became inspired by Schoenberg's innovation. In any case, Frank Bridge, his tutor, was clearly a massive influence. I discovered this quote from an interview that Britten held near the end of his life, reminiscing about his youth and his relationship with Frank Bridge. He said, "Bridge never wanted to influence me too strongly too young, and yet he knew that he had to present something very firm for this stiff, naive little boy to react about. In everything he did for me, there were perhaps above all 2 cardinal principles. One was that you should try to find yourself and be true to what you found. The other, obviously connected with it, was his scrupulous attention to good technique, the business of saying clearly what was in one's mind." Britten took these lessons to heart, and he carried them throughout his career. Britten was very close with Bridge, and they kindled a lifelong friendship. From the beginning, Britten would spend school holidays away with Bridge, and he respected him very much. Bridge himself was a romantic composer at heart, and he wanted to stay with characteristically British sounds and ideas. Though he didn't achieve massive success or notability, he lived on for Britten as an undeniable influence. The largest lesson that he passed on to his pupil was the precision of effect. A quote from Bridge says, "The purpose of good technique is to provide opportunities for the imagination." Britten, in the same interview, said, "Bridge's loathing of all sloppiness and amateurishness set me standards to aim for that I've never forgotten. He taught me to think and feel through the instruments that I was writing for." From a performer's perspective, Britten's knowledge and skill in this regard makes music quite enjoyable to play, because everything is designed with such foresight and care for the instrumentalist. I think that Britten learned early on that the performer is an important piece of the music-making process in conjunction with the composition itself, and they should not be manhandled or forgotten. We will will discuss this concept in greater detail later when we talked about Britten's writing for the oboist to whom the piece was dedicated, Leon Goossens. Another quote from Britten said, "Bridge would play what I meant, or play what I'd written and demand if it was really what I meant." As Britten reached his late teen years and began to rebel against classic tonality, Bridge would challenge his reasoning and demand music that held thought and concern, though he never wanted to dull his students' creative spark. It wasn't so much a question of rebellion, but of reason. Britten entered the Royal College of Music at the age of 17 in 1930 on scholarship. His composition teacher, John Ireland, had to fight for his entry into the college and convinced Ralph Vaughan Williams, who was also on the panel, to grant his scholarship. During his time at the college, he studied formally with John Ireland for composition and Arthur Benjamin for piano, but he continued to work with Frank Bridge and considered him to be his main tutor. John Ireland saw most of his work as well, however, and was greatly impressed with the speed at which Britten composed between lessons, as well as his dedication to improve. During his time at the Royal College of Music, only one piece, the Phantasy in F minor, was performed, despite Bridge's attempts to step in. He fought for Britten's works to be performed, saying that it was a shame that a studying composer couldn't even hear his own work. But the college didn't change their stance. Britten worked immensely hard to develop his style here with early defining works. This quote from an interview at the age of 50 tells a little bit about what he experienced looking back. He said, "I feel I didn't learn very much at the Royal College. I think I can say that at the Royal College, not nearly enough account was taken of the exceptionally gifted musician. When you are immensely full of energy and ideas, you don't want to waste your time being taken through elementary exercises in dictation." Years later, Britten does not credit his success or growth as a composer to his time at the Royal College of Music, but rather his personal dedication to improve, his natural talent, and of course, his years of study with Frank Bridge. Britten wrote a lot during his time at the Royal College, but much of it has been lost or was never published, in part due to the lack of performances and opportunities to share his work. He wrote the String Quartet in D in 1931, and it was one of his first complete substantial works, as well as his first major instrumental score. It showed a great deal of conventionality and was essentially diatonic with melodies that were expected and the same tone structures. He spent less than 1 month on it and then set it aside until he finished it at the end of his life, and it was published then. The Sinfonietta also took less than 1 month to compose, and it was Britten's first published piece. At the time, he began experimenting with innovative structures and forms, and this piece combines two sonata-like structures with a variation interlude. Critics called it a technical mastery showcase, and commented on his ability to utilize contrast with descriptions like controlled and complex, as well as his use of lyricism and dramaticism. At this time, he was very interested in composing instrumental music and creating new musical forms which pushed conventional practice. The term phantasy was coined by English musicologist Walter Wilson Cobbett in 1905, and it described a single movement work without any breaks that was intended to allow for compositional freedom. The Phantasy in F minor, a string quintet work, was entered into the Cobbett Phantasy competition, and it won. This piece continued early attention outside of the college after the publishing of the Sinfonietta earlier in the year, and this is the only piece to be performed at the Royal College of Music during his time of study there. Frank Bridge, who was still acting as his primary teacher at the time, had previously entered and also won the Cobbett Phantasy competition himself, and it is to be assumed that he encouraged Britten to participate and work on a fantasy piece as well. And that brings us up to the time when the Fantasy Quartet was composed. The Fantasy Quartet is written for oboe, violin, viola, and cello, and as the fantasy title indicates, it is a single movement work without any breaks. The fantasy is 15 minutes in length and was dedicated to Leon Goossens, a famous oboist who we will discuss shortly. Many of the sources that I read falsely quoted that Britten wrote the Fantasy Quartet for entry in the Cobbett Fantasy competition, in part because of its title and also because of his entry the year prior. This is actually false, because he could not actually enter the competition. As the previous winner, he was not able to enter again. Instead, he took this on as an opportunity to perfect his formal structures that he had been experimenting with in his previous winning Phantasy and also the Sinfonietta. Britten spent less than a month composing this work as well, which is a similar pace to his other compositions, and it wasn't performed until almost a year later. The first ever performance was put on BBC Radio in concert by Leon Goossens, to whom it was dedicated, Andre Monchot, Eric Bray, and Jack Scheinborn. Britten wrote in his diary, "Goossens does his part splendidly. The rest, although they are intelligent players, aren't really first-class instrumentalists." The first public performance took place a few months later at a meeting of the Music Society in Westminster in a concert of fantasies, and it was reviewed well in the Observer newspaper the next day. Its international debut came in Florence, Italy, at the International Society for Contemporary Music competition. Goossens performed here as well, this time with the Griller String Quartet, and Britten's diary showed a more pleasant review. He wrote, "Goossens and the Grillers really pay my fantasy very beautifully, and it's very well received." As the second piece to be published, Hawks and Son published Britten's Fantasy Quartet in 1935. The review in the Observer, after the public performance in Westminster, glowed, saying, "Endless invention and facility. Britten takes what he wants and does not trouble about what others have thought well to take." A view of the Daily Telegraph, however, was less enthusiastic. The solving of technical problems seemed to occupy the composer's mind to the exclusion of musical ideas. Anthony Payne, a contributor to the Tempo Music Journal at Oxford, wrote that Benjamin Britten already possessed in his early 20s a most astonishing technical assurance has never been in doubt, nor that he commanded a range of feeling and of stylistic integrity which proclaimed a uniquely precocious maturity. This comment about a uniquely precocious maturity is key, and it is important to remember that Britten composed this piece at the young age of 19. Paul Kildee, the editor of Britten's collected writings for Oxford, wrote 2 blunt reviews. He said it was not a strong piece, and that it lacked melodic content and distinctive writing for the oboe. Quite harsh. Anthony Payne, full of praise for this work, writes, "What sets the Fantasy Quartet above Britten's previous chamber music is the individuality of its language, with its hints of parody in the introduction and its cosmopolitan lyricism. It's unmistakably stamped with Britten's personality." Peter Evans, another contributor to the Tempo Music Journal, felt that the composer was not quite mature enough at this time. He wrote, "Britten's harmonic language is not yet developed to prevent falling back on a bland, rather impersonal pastoral manner, while sprawling rhapsodic lines honor a convention more than they meet an expressive need of the so clear-sighted young composer. I hope that you all can come to form your own opinions of the piece and decide for yourself, when you hear the performance, if you're more willing to praise the composer for his maturity, invention, and cleanliness, or gripe about his impersonal writing and technical dominance in place of musical decisions." Britten dedicated the piece to Leon Goossens, the English oboist who put the oboe back on the map. His revival and popularity of the Mozart Oboe Quartet KV 370, also written for oboe and strings, created a new interest. Goossens grew out of a musical family and achieved fame in his own right at a young age. He also studied at the Royal College of Music and was teaching there during Britten's time of study, where they met formally. Frank Bridge taught Britten to write for the particular instrument and player in mind, and Britten did an exceptional job of this with his composition. Goossens is famed with introducing vibrato to English oboists, and he boasted an easy, wide range with a mastery of clean articulations and extremely soft dynamics with easy sustains. Britten made use of these technical advances and showcased Goossens' intelligent, artistic playing. You'll hear seemingly endless lines, which were written to showcase the oboe's rich tone color and vibrato, both which were unique to Goossens at this time. He He would also play extreme dynamics so soft that audiences would crane their neck forward in an attempt to hear, and Britten capitalized on this talent with a wide dynamic range. Goosen's short, straight reeds were revolutionary at the time and allowed him to blow freely and enjoy all of the positive elements of his playing that I mentioned. Goosen did make the oboe reeds himself, though, as he employed others to scrape his reeds for him, and was intensely particular about choosing and accepting the reeds presented to him. This is a characteristically European idea for oboists, especially at that time, and his particular taste and preference in reed choice shaped the popular British reed scrape. Additionally, I think it's interesting that Leon Goosen played on the same open-key oboe from his youth throughout his entire career, even as instrument designs improved. He was often encouraged to upgrade from his archaic model, but he loved his oboe so much that he sought success without switching over to a more modern construction. Now, on to the nuts and bolts of the composition. Britten had been experimenting with innovative forms, and he finally mastered it here. Some theorists describe it as a sonata with a slow movement inserted between the development and the recapitulation. The composition overall acts as an arc and combines four distinct sections: the andante section in common time, the agitated section in cut time, the slow section in 3/4 time, and the andante section repeated in reverse order at the end. The piece opens with a silent bar, which Peter Evans describes as a quasi-programmatic scheme, as a straining of the ears, as if he's calling the audience to attention before the work can really begin. The piece then marches in, almost from a distance, growing out of the silent bar, and at the end, it seems to march out. Arnold Whittle calls it recessional in character, because it employs dissolution rather than resolution. Throughout the composition, the melodic themes are introduced and dance onward, shifting between the foreground and the background. Britten's economy of content and controlled use of it allows for a seamless connection between each part. In fact, Britten is often known as an economic composer because he writes in such a clean, controlled manner, and he recycles musical ideas as if to wring out every last drop of artistic expression before muddying the texture with something new. Next, we will pull out and discuss the themes and their uses. I have created related names for the themes and will refer to them under these titles, so hopefully you can help keep track of them and also recognize them in the complete performance. The march theme is showcased at the beginning and ending as we march into and out of the piece. This theme is also the glue that holds the composition together, as it connects through the entire piece in various forms and is used in transition times between the bigger sections of the piece. As we move across the arc, you'll hear the march theme shifting consistently from the background and into the foreground when it's needed. Though it's very tonal to the ear, it's actually quite unsettled in context between the tonal centers of G major and C major at the beginning. Let's listen to the cello play the march theme. I've titled this the principal theme because it's the melody that you're most likely to pick out, and you'll probably be humming it on your way home this afternoon. It's a controlled, simple melody that primarily belongs to the oboe, and it shows off Goosen's long, easy blowing lines, though it is also set throughout the other voices or in fragments of the piece. It's introduced shortly after the march theme in the andante section, and I will now perform this theme for you. be the most developed melodic idea in the piece. Its contrasting sense of rounding and pulling away from the central point supports a sudden agitated shift as the composition moves into the next, faster section. After the introduction of the expanding theme, Britten introduces another and then comes back to it for a clever sequence of development. Before we discuss its development, we'll demonstrate the theme in the violin. As the theme comes back for its development, Britten utilizes a clever pattern through the use of fifths. It starts on the viola and then moves through each voice in the violin, cello, and finishing in the oboe. The pattern that he sets up allows him to explore different tonal centers in a patterned, decisive way and end in the same place that it began. I've circled the notes related by fifths and have written out their pattern on the left-hand side. Starting on the viola on a D, the melody outlines movement up to the next perfect fifth on A. The next note of importance is a perfect fifth relationship to E, and then there's a clear walk up to the next perfect fifth on B. The violin takes over its melody, and its starting note in F sharp is a perfect fifth up from the end of the viola statement. When the cello takes its turn, it follows the pattern and begins on A sharp, a fifth up from the violin's end on D sharp. Here, Britten chooses the enharmonic spelling and writes the melody within B flat instead of A sharp. As the pattern completes itself, the oboe statement lands in the original tonal center as at the beginning of the developmental section. This is the kind of clever positioning and well thought out technique that makes Britten sound so seamless. Backing up to before the development of the expanding theme, Britten introduces the trill theme. It's accompanied by pentatonic fragments and repetitive figures that lends an exotic flavor. When the oboe takes over the theme from the cello, it replaces the trill feature of the theme with a quick scalar run. It acts as a brief intermission between the statement and development of the expanding theme, as we just discussed, and offers an unexpected sound to contrast the control of the principal theme, for instance. The cello will demonstrate this theme for you. The introduction of the pastoral theme comes at the beginning of the slow section. At this point, the oboe has made a brief retreat and Britten explores writing for the string trio alone. This is yet another obvious showcase of Britten's talent to write to the unique instruments. All oboists praise the composer who gives them the much-needed break in the middle to recuperate and prepare for a big finale. Plus, the break also offers a bit of textual contrast to engage the listener. The pastoral melody is the least developed theme of the piece, and it's only stated once in its entirety by the viola at the beginning of the slow section. However, its role as an opener for the next section and supporter of a free-flowing structure to come is important enough to note. I believe that, in a way, it's more related to the principal theme than a new complete melodic idea on its own. You'll hear a presence of the iconic perfect fifth leaps down and a similar melodic arc to the principal theme. Let's listen to the viola play the pastoral theme. and is also introduced during the string trio section of the slow tempo. This is the most florid theme that Britten introduces, and it offers flexibility and pliability within a section full of shifting levels of emotion, tempo, and agitation. Varying peaks and levels of intensity grow, especially after the oboe's re-entrance, and this emotional theme shows up in snippets during each instrument's written stanzas. It will be demonstrated in the violin. I will quickly flash up my sources so that you know that I wasn't making everything up before this point. And then we will move on to the part the evolving reading for. Finally, after all of this demonstration, background, and analysis, we will share our performance of Britten's Phantasy Quartet Opus 2. Hopefully you are able to follow the ingenious art form of the piece, pull out important melodic ideas, and create your own thoughts and opinions about the fantasy. I will be answering a few questions at the end, so if you have any thoughts or questions, please just hold on to them, and I will do my best to give you an answer. We've had such a great time putting this together, and I think we all agree that it's truly a fun piece of chamber music to play, and I really hope you all enjoy it. Thank you for your support, and of course, your presence here this afternoon. Let me turn on the lights.
What the piece does, kind of generally, what is it doing to you? It's a fantasy quartet, so one would assume that it evokes thoughts or emotions. And you don't have to tell us about the whole thing, but maybe some examples.
I think that for me, it almost, I have no idea if this is what you're thinking, but for me, it's kind of heaven versus being on earth, and a lot of it is so grounded, and it just feels really earthly, like it's connected to something. And then with kind of the disembodied oboe cadenza section, it almost feels like you're just flying through stars and stuff, and there's other things going on, but you don't even care because it's so beautiful, you know. So I kind of feel like parts of it are heaven and parts of it are really grounded like earth. Any other questions? How many of you would give this the piece itself, not our performance, how many of you would give the composition a positive critique or a negative critique? Positives? You like it? Anyone doesn't like the piece? Wow! Yeah, I guess. Well, if we don't have any questions, thank you guys so much for being here today and listening and appreciating what we have to say. There are some refreshments out in the hall.